Okay, thank you for joining us today to learn about the top 4 components of an effective call monitoring program. We have a lot of really great information to share today, so we're going to go on and get started. We'll try and save some time at the end of the presentation for questions, but I would like to encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A features located on the WebEx toolbar as they arise. That will be stopping the speakers to ask the relevant questions as we go. To introduce myself, my name is Sarah Morris. I'm Managing Editor at KirkpatrickPrice. I've been working in the industry for 3 years developing content to help keep companies informed and educated about industry trends and best practices. I hold a certification in General Information Security Fundamentals, and I would also like to take this opportunity to encourage you to check out our blog and our webinar pages on our website. They're great places to find all kinds of resources, and we are constantly adding more and more information daily. So let me introduce our speakers for today. Jessie Skibby has over 10 years of experience in the ARM industry as Vice President of Strategic Development and Chief Compliance Officer for KirkpatrickPrice. She is focused on assisting clients in meeting regulatory compliance and information security objectives. Jessie is a Certified Credit and Collections Compliance Officer. She also holds the ACA Scholar designation. She is an Information Systems Security Professional, a Certified Receivables Compliance Professional, as well as a PCI Qualified Security Assessor. We also have with us today Cheryl Cooper. She is General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer for Monarch Recovery Management. Cheryl helps maintain Monarch's exemplary compliance record. She remains current on the constantly evolving laws and regulations in the industry, and she oversees and manages regulatory compliance within the organization, as well as designs and implements rigorous internal controls, policies, and procedures. We also have with us today Mark Cataldo, Director of Credit and Collections, is responsible for all business development efforts within the credit and collections vertical for CallMiner. He is a passionate believer that through the use of advanced analytics tools, the ARM industry can achieve dramatic improvements in collection rates, customer service, and compliance security. Prior to joining CallMiner, Mark was the Director of Major Accounts for Soundbite and has been involved in the credit and collections industry for over a decade. Due to his many years of experience and insight, Mark is often sought out by ARM industry veterans for advice on how to improve operational productivity and manage compliance through the intelligent use of a broad variety of technologies. Through the years, Mark has been asked to participate or speak in many industry events, including trade show panels, regional ACA sessions, and attorney network meetings. To give you just a little bit of background about who we are at KirkpatrickPrice, we are a licensed CPA firm providing assurance services to over 300 clients in more than 42 states, Canada, Asia, and Europe. The firm has over 10 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. We specialize in regulatory compliance as well as information security. We provide consulting services such as policy and procedure drafting, risk assessment, and internal audit plan development, as well as CFPB readiness audits. We also provide guidance and audit services for the following frameworks: SSA 16, SOC 2, PCI, ISMA, and ISO, as well as a few others. So at this time, I'm going to remind you one more time to ask any questions that you have using the Q&A feature, and I'll turn it over to you, Jessie.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm super excited about this topic for so many reasons. First of all, because we have 2 amazing guests that are going to help us talk through some best practices in this area. But I think first and foremost, you know, as you just saw on the last slide, we've been working in the collections industry for the past several years, and personally been doing some, you know, consulting, policy procedure drafting, as well as gap assessments. And from an auditor's perspective, you know, taking a look at what is happening right now in the collections environment and looking at the areas of risk, there's so much that you can tell from, you know, the monitoring of calls, because, you know, the #1 area of risk being, you know, communication with consumers. And the call and monitoring program is such a critical piece, a critical component of the compliance management system to be able to monitor and look for areas of improvement and make adjustments. And I'm excited that Mark is here with us, because I don't think we can really talk about this topic without talking about some of the abilities of speech analytics, and also, you know, with Cheryl having the boots on the ground experience of setting this in place in her organization and enhancing it. But I always like to bring us back down to earth, and I like to talk about the Wikipedia definition of monitoring, you know, kind of a silly thing, but really it's observing a situation for any thing that may occur over time using a monitoring or measuring device of some sort, right? So that's the Wikipedia definition. The reason why I wanted to do this, because I think people often confuse monitoring with auditing, and auditing is a much different scenario. You must maintain operational independence to do an effective audit, and it's not something that occurs over time. Monitoring, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, monitoring should be occurring within multiple levels, and definitely having a supervisor in an operational role is completely acceptable to perform monitoring, as well as monitoring at other levels in the organization. So today we're going to talk about the 4 critical core components of an effective call monitoring program, and those are the structure and oversight, the management, I would say development of staff, the scorecard components themselves, and then, of course, reporting and analytics. You know, what are you doing with the information once you have it? So we can move on there. So again, a couple of reasons why it's important. I think everybody on the call today most likely knows that, which, oh, by the way, we have a record attendance on this call today. I'm so excited about that. We have over 128 people on the line listening in. So I know that several of you hopefully will have some questions throughout this presentation, so I definitely want to encourage you to ask those as they come up. If we don't get to them through the presentation today, we will definitely get to those, via email, or get you some answers as the presentation ends. So anyway, some references for you here, and of course in the CFPB examination procedures, they talking about the core components of a compliance management system, and this was reiterated very recently in the winter 2005 highlights, which came out yesterday, again talking about the importance of these components within your compliance management system, including policies and procedures, training, as well as monitoring and the necessary follow-up being corrective action. So the components to be examined, during this process are the CCO's involvement in monitoring efforts, monitoring and testing schedules, the risk assessment process, how do you determine what to monitor and what to audit, tools utilized to calculate monitoring efforts, and there again, that's analytics, how are you performing that? Compliance monitoring, testing, and corrective action reports, and then of course following up with the timely corrective action. So now we're going to get into structure and oversight, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you, Cheryl.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I don't know, the participants on here are probably at all different levels of this, but I think everybody is on board with the fact that the QA/compliance department is of vital importance to everyone who performs any sort of collection work, and just getting the department set up or having a QA staff is not enough. You have to have a strong and knowledgeable QA manager. You want to select a manager for this position that has adequate knowledge of the laws, adequate knowledge of the client requirements, and of the collection process. As far as for the actual QA staff, there's 2 different ways you could go. Some people like to use ex-collectors. There's positives and negatives with that. If you're going to select collectors, you want to select ones that have a good compliance record and don't have bad habits of their own already. And if you're going to pick the people who don't have any sort of collection background, you've got to be prepared and ready to invest in significant training and coaching and mentoring, either through the Chief Compliance Officer or a designee and or the QA manager as well. Because obviously there's a much greater learning curve in that sort of thing. Also, in selecting an ex-collector, you want to consider whether you want to do that, because sometimes ex-collectors that are on the floor, coming from your own organization at least, may have alliances to other people on the floor and not want to score somebody who is their friend in a bad way, or other times they might have something against someone who was on the floor who, they want to score that person in a bad way. So you just have to consider, all of those sorts of things. When you're picking someone who is a non-collector, you might want to consider someone with like a strong customer service background if that's what you're looking to portray. But again, the training time and the lead time with that is significant. So, you know, I think that you have to be aware of that and try to, you know, have a sort of a mix of both for the best way, at least getting started. In addition, with the call selection part of this, you have to try to figure out how many calls you're going to score per month. And, you know, when you're doing that, some of it is client-driven, and some of it is just internal within your organization. But you want to make sure that you're choosing calls, the same number of calls per collector per month, whether the collector is a good collector or a bad collector or just an average collector. You don't want to vary, you know, the number of calls per month per collector. It doesn't mean that if someone is struggling or, you know, there's a problem going on that you don't, you know, maybe want to listen to some extra calls there. But I think as a general practice, you want to be fair across the board and score the same number of calls for everyone, whatever number you make that for the month. You know, because otherwise there's all sorts of other issues that could come into that. And in addition to just the client requirements on that, selecting the calls, you want to, you know, also use your risk assessment and your any other internal determination as to, you know, what you're trying to accomplish in listening to these calls. You know, when you conduct your risk assessment and you find, you know, what your greatest area of risk is or where the biggest deficiencies are, it might be wise to sort of, you know, try to listen to as many calls in that particular category so that you can correct the behavior. You also want to make sure that the calls are selected randomly. You don't want to, over the month, you know, you don't want to pick them all from the same day, not all from the same week, not all from the same client or portfolio. And you might want to consider doing something like, you know, giving feedback more than once a month so that a collector knows where they stand during the month, much like a student would in a classroom.
Cheryl, I have a question for you. I know that you mentioned the word risk assessment, and I think that I often hear some confusion on this. Now, when you say utilize your risk assessment for determining, you know, your call selection, can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit more on how, what are some basic things that you would look at from a risk perspective?
Well, I think, you know, as a chief compliance officer, your risk assessment is going to be, you know, are the collectors meeting the client requirements? That's number one. Are they giving all the required disclosures? Are they saying, you know, the things, the scripts as they're meant to be? Are they, are the collectors, you know, giving all the disclosures that are required by the client, but also required by the law? And in addition, you know, you might want to consider looking at another aspect, which is if your chief compliance officer sort of works with risk management / general counsel, where are the factors that are causing your company the most lawsuits or consumer complaints or you know, complaints through the CFPB portal or any other area so that you can get an idea of where, you know, there's a deficiency and what you need to focus on. That's
right. So basically, we're talking about where do you maintain the highest risk of either violating the law, state law, federal law, or violating something that you have in place with your client contractually.
Absolutely.
I just kind of wanted to make sense to that because I think a lot of people are confused when you say what is a risk assessment, but a risk assessment is really nothing more than I think people do kind of in their minds already. It's just kind of formalizing it and utilizing that data in your call monitoring efforts. But I also wanted to point out something else here. On the slide, I have call selection 5 to 30 calls per agent per month. And I know a lot of people I hear have a minimum of 5 calls per agent per month, but I know as an auditor that statistically that is not a sound number based on the number of calls that an agent makes per month. So I wanted to ask Mark a question right here, because I know that some of the ways that people use speech analytics is to help them identify calls and to monitor, to monitor maybe sometimes 100% of the calls. So Mark, could you talk a little bit about how you see companies in, in the collections industry utilizing speech analytics to, I guess, boost that number, and how are they using it to identify calls to then send to the manual QA agents?
Yeah, sure. And I, following up on what Cheryl said, I agree with everything that she said. And what people sometimes misunderstand about speech analytics is they look at it as a means to replace the current quality monitoring program that companies may have, and that's not what we're trying to do. What we want to do, what speech analytics is designed to do, is rather than take that 1%, 2%, or 5 to 30 calls that you're listening to randomly, per agent per month, I like to say that you're currently just throwing darts at the wall and arbitrarily listening to 5 calls, whether they're good or bad. Speech analytics takes all the subjectivity out of quality monitoring. So whether you have a monitor who likes or dislikes an employee, it's not going to matter anymore. What we want to do is listen to all the calls if possible and point your quality monitoring team in the direction of, these are the calls that should be listened to. Something happened. There was no mini Miranda, or there was harassment language. But there was something that happened on that call that makes it stand out from all the rest of the calls. So it's not necessarily looking at and listening to all of the calls where everything was done correctly. It's identifying areas of improvement from an efficiencies perspective that we can really help your quality team get through more calls by pointing them in that right direction.
Absolutely. The one thing, too, to kind of round out this topic, too, we're really talking about structure and oversight. And I think what I really wanted to make sure we all understand is that, the actual assembly of, what you're going to select as calls and the reporting structure, I wanted to make sure that people understand the importance of having policies, procedures, and work instructions documented. Having everything that you do documented effectively, not only does it satisfy, your compliance management system and the CFPB requirements, but also it sets expectations for employees that are doing the function. So definitely having some documentation around your monitoring program is what I want to stress here and definitely recommend.
Hey, Jesse, we have a question.
Sure.
The question is, we have agents that work 5 to 8 shifts and others that work 4 to 10 shifts. Is it acceptable to do 1 call per day when the agents are all in the same department?
So to do 1 call per day when the agents are in the same department? That's the question?
Yes. Yes.
Well, I think that 1 call per day, I don't know exactly what that equates to as far as the per month. I guess if you're doing 1 call per day, it could potentially be up to 30 calls. Well, they're not working 7 days a week, but it could be up to 20 calls, I guess, per month. I think from a sheer number standpoint, that seems acceptable to me, considering some companies are doing as low as 5 per month, which, like I said before, I don't really feel is statistically sound. But I don't know that I see an issue with that. Cheryl, do you have any comments to make on that?
I would just say that I wouldn't necessarily limit it to just 1 call per day per collector, because you can only imagine, as we're all sitting here, you're hoping that 1 collector may make, 200 calls in a day or more.
Right.
So picking 1 out of that, when you do it statistically, I don't necessarily agree to just do 1 call. And I agree with Mark that you have to use a combination, and we, here use a combination of speech analytics with the sampling that way, as well as with the individuals. But when you use a multi-layered approach, which I know is a little bit better on, later on, you can have people screening the calls, and they may not be scored. You don't have to score every call that you are monitoring. So I would say you want to try to listen to, either whether you're scoring them or not, more than one call per person per month, per day.
Mm-hmm. I also believe that everything should be scalable to the size of the organization. So really there's a lot of more factors I think that I would take into consideration. You know, how many total employees do they have? Is there a supervisor within earshot? You know, what is the environment? I think that you have to consider all those factors when you determine how many calls to listen to, whether it's per day, per week, per month. I don't think there's any exact science to the calculation of that, but I think that it should be scalable to the size of the organization. I think, you know, one of the things about incorporating speech analytics is it's a great tool, but it doesn't necessarily make financial sense for smaller companies, and that's something that people need to be able to get around. I mean, ideally, it would be great if it was available to everyone, but I think that is something that, my purpose of doing this webinar was to really talk about all the options, and I think people need to understand that their solutions need to be set according to the size of their company. So let's go ahead and move on.
Jesse, can we just address one question, because you and I discussed this, and I see it up on the where the person says, how do you not tie this call selection to an agent's performance? And since we discussed that yesterday, if you don't mind, I'd like to just a minute.
Absolutely.
What that bullet point was meant to address was you don't want to just, an agent's performance obviously is very, very important, and whether they're compliant or whether they're not compliant is also very, very important to the company as well as to the clients on which behalf you're collecting. But what I think was meant by that bullet point is that just because you have a very high-performing collector doesn't mean that you can or should ignore scoring that collector, listening to that collector, or monitoring that collector. Even the most experienced collectors make mistakes, and so that bullet point was really meant for don't ignore a good collector just because they're performing well for your agency. You want to make sure that you score or listen to or monitor inexperienced as well as experienced, and you want to score and monitor your best collectors as well as the worst ones. That's really what was meant by that bullet point.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate you clarifying that too, because I've seen that many times before when they'll say, well, if the agent has been here for 10 years, I may monitor them less than someone who's been here for a year. And I definitely agree with Cheryl in that they should be the same. I think that you stand to find something or to look at an opportunity for improvement, even for the more tenured collectors. And I think more of a random sampling and a reasonable number for all of agents should be what people should do. So Cheryl, I'm going to go ahead and let you continue then with the management of staff, giving us some tips along those areas.
Okay. Well, with respect to the hiring and selection process, I think, again, as far as you have to look at both sides of choosing someone with a collection background or not. If you do choose one with a collection background, I would, suggest that it's the best practice to have them go through your own internal training, even if they have collection background from somewhere else. Be careful to have them critically evaluated to that there are no bad habits or biases that are existing, from prior experiences. If you find that, after the training, I typically have them score a certain number of calls, and they come directly to me as the Chief Compliance Officer, and I compare them and make sure that they are, consistent with what we are looking for. And then if not, then there's a mentoring and coaching process. As far as hiring new people for the QA department, again, I think that you can pick people that have a customer service background or that just are bright and that you can train, but you have to just be aware of that learning curve and the mentoring process that's necessary to get them to where they understand what your agency wants and also what the client expectations are and even what the laws are. This is such a heavily regulated industry. We mentioned it briefly also before, the multi-level approach to monitoring. and there, you know, it doesn't just have to be your QA department that does the monitoring. As far as scoring, I think that the QA department should be the sole place that does the scoring. It should not be done by a manager who may or may not have biases towards any of the particular collectors that work for him or her. But certainly use your managers to do live monitoring as well as monitoring of, you know, calls after the fact, and also, you know, have your QA department do live monitoring in addition to just scoring. And this is another area where we heavily use speech analytics to do monitoring. The speech analytics in our agency has been an invaluable tool. It allows us to search for calls that you wouldn't necessarily just pick up on, and I know Mark can speak to this, but some of the categories that you get to determine what those categories are, but some of them are things that you wouldn't necessarily pick up on, not bad words or things like that, but just like the length of a call, how long the call went on, or the amount of silence that's contained in a call. You want to know if a collector is putting somebody on hold and leaving them there. It can also lead to, you know, finding and uncovering problems. You know, then in our agency, and I know in many others, the QA people are then overseen by compliance department as far as verifying everything is, you know, fair and equitable as far as the way that they're scored, and then tracked and logged in an appropriate way as well.
Yeah, and you know, I'd add to that, every client is different in their demands and in terms of what they ask of you. Some clients will require you to still manually listen to calls or manually touch a certain percentage of calls. Others may not. You know, the question just came out saying, why wouldn't you just listen to 100% of calls and look at the anomalies? So that's what a lot of clients are doing right now is putting all calls through speech analytics, pointing their team in the direction of the calls that need the most attention, potentially changing some of the descriptions and roles of the quality monitoring team to, since they're able to get through more calls, and the benefit of you know, a large vocabulary like ours that gives you the ability to read the transcripts where you don't have to listen to the call, you're able to get through more calls. It gives them more time in their day to potentially do other things like coaching and training on those anomalies when they find something. You know, but ultimately it comes back to what are the ultimate business goals and objectives that you're trying to solve as an organization, and do you need to have a blended environment of automation of scorecards and speech analytics versus manually scoring those yourselves?
We have a lot of great questions coming in the Q&A box, and I'm not sure if we should kind of take some time to answer some of these questions right now, but actually there's a really great question that I saw that I wanted to bring up, because I think it's really kind of something, Mark, that you and I were talking about before, you and I and Cheryl. If an agency has the ability to afford speech analytics to monitor all calls, does it make sense to just rely on your results from speech analytics provider on 100% of your calls as opposed to manual monitoring? I think that both of you, Cheryl and Mark, you have differing opinions on this, so I kind of would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, you know, and I tell people all the time, speech analytics, for the most part, will be a self-funding type of solution, and I say that because of the ROI that you pull out of it. And you know, it ties into some of these other questions about the length of calls. It allows you to do so much more than just get to listen to more than 5 calls per agent per month. You know, by going through and accessing all of the calls, you're able to, not just from a compliance perspective, understand did they state all the statements you needed them to state, but really it boils down to a performance aspect. What are the behaviors that the agents are demonstrating on those calls that's leading them to be successful or not successful, that's leading them to be on a 10-minute talk-off that results in a non-payment? So speech analytics, when you roll up your sleeves and start to understand how you can be successful with it, you can really boil it down to the specifics of what is actually being said on those conversations. could be very specific in terms of how are they even asking for a payment? Are they asking for a balance in full, or are they immediately going to a settlement? Are they asking for a payment directly, or are they asking for it in a passive way? How much can you pay today with a check or credit card versus, well, when do you intend to take care of this? So speech analytics allows you to look at the language, look at the tonality, obviously, look at the silence on the call, and really help drive ROI in many different areas of your organization.
I don't disagree with what Mark has said, but I just feel that speech analytics is only one aspect of it, and it gives false positive results, and so it's not perfect. And it also does not indicate like which person's tone is poor on the call, so you end up having to go back. And as these modules go on, and the way that our agency has done it is our entire agency is really based upon compliance, and compliance is first, and so bonuses and other things that we do here are all tied to compliance, and so as a result, and the QA scores, collectors per month, and so as a result, I don't feel that it's equitable to just rely upon a computer program to tell you what the score is for a particular collector on a particular call. There's always a human element, and there's always some kind of, something else that comes about in a call. Every call is actually a different little story within itself. And so we use speech analytics here very heavily, but I, personally as the Chief Compliance Officer, as well as General Counsel here, believe that it's just one part of the tool and that you can't be without the people aspect of it as well. But I would not really want to run the QA department or our compliance department without the tool because it is really an invaluable thing, and you can do so many of the things that Mark said, and it does help you screen things. It's just that I wouldn't use it as just the scoring aspect of it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, my personal opinion is that it really does create a holistic approach when you add the two, together, and you have the multiple levels of monitoring. And there was another really great question that I liked, because this person is thinking like an auditor, and I love that. The question is setting a percentage of calls a more sound plan to have implemented? That way the number of collectors increase/decrease, then there is still consistency with your procedures. I love this question because I think that ideally, establishing your policy saying that you will monitor a percentage of calls makes more sense to me. I like that. I think you have to be careful with the way you word that in your policy and procedure, because you may want to, if you're selecting a specific type of calls. Plus, I think the number of calls, the percentage of calls, as it increases and decreases potentially over different months of time, you have to make sure that you're adequately staffed, to handle those influxes in potentially the number of calls. So I like utilizing a percentage as your threshold. I just think you have to be, careful with the way you manage that, I guess.
Yeah, but Jesse, the only thing I would say to that is you also want to manage the risk associated with that. So you may have, by setting a certain percentage of calls at 100, if you have an agent who fields 100 calls versus an agent who fields 2,000, obviously the percentage of risk on the agent that is handling 2,000 calls is higher. So you want to balance that, accordingly.
Yep, it's a great point. Well, let's move on. Since we have about 20 minutes left in the presentation, I wanted to get into talking about scorecard components, because this, I think, is a big area. I don't think there's anything black and white that says, what does your scorecard contain? I mean, I think we're going to talk about, obviously, you have to incorporate what your client's expectations are for scoring, but there are several other ways that you can decide what needs to be on my scorecard. So I think what I wanted to talk about here was some best practices in developing that. And we talked a little bit earlier about performing that risk assessment, So basically from a scorecard component, standpoint, that would include maybe, for example, what are consumers complaining about? We talked about utilizing the CFPB complaint statistics to make sure that you're monitoring for for the same things that consumers are complaining about. You know, for example, in the, I think it was the fall 2014 highlights, as well as it was talked about again in the winter highlights about, you know, consumers complaining or them finding areas of, you know, third-party disclosure being an issue. So if they're finding that, you better make sure that that's one of those high-risk items on your scorecard component. So understanding what's going on in the industry, what consumers are complaining about, what the CFPB is telling you, they're finding during their examinations, all of those things combined are really ways that you can perform your risk assessment, quote unquote, to determine what you should put on your scorecard. I also want to talk about the fact of, you know, creating some separation between compliance and quality objectives. I see this a lot, and I have seen where, you know, a terrible example is if, for example, the agent fails, you know, or commits an FDCPA violation, but the rest of the call is completely perfect, you know, that score being a passing score, in my opinion, is not the right thing to do. I think that there should be some higher risk scorecard components that cause an automatic failure on the call itself, and you should separate, you know, and I personally, if I was a chief compliance officer in the collections environment today, I would want to know what is my compliance score versus what are my quality or what are my production scores, because that gives you an idea, and it allows you to put your thumb on the pulse of what's going on from a compliance perspective. And I know that that's difficult for some smaller organizations to create that separation, but I wanted to at least, you know, kind of plant that idea with you, because I feel that having a separate score for compliance versus quality would be really useful as you're making improvements to your overall, you know, compliance management system and training efforts. So I don't know, Cheryl, did you have anything to add to this particular slide?
No, I really don't.
On the next.
Other than just to say that, you know, whatever scorecard that you start out with doesn't mean that's what you're stuck with, and it's an ever-evolving, refining sort of process. And, you know, if you put something on your initial scorecard based on your risk assessment and all these other factors that are on here, and you find that now, you know, all of your collectors are doing that regularly on an everyday basis, and so that's just taking up a spot on the scorecard, you can always remove it and change it, and, you know, as long as you're giving the appropriate notice to everybody and giving them the chance to adjust and add other things, you can weight things more heavily that you are trying to make a point over, so that if the collectors are, you know, knowing that the score counts for something more, then you know, you just can modify the card. It's just you're not stuck with what you start with is basically what I wanted to get across.
Yeah, that's actually an excellent point, because I think one of the things that we hope people get out of this session today is, you know, taking a look at your existing scorecard and looking at it on a regular basis to determine, is it still accurate? Is it still, are these still my high risk items? You know, should I modify it? Of course, I always recommend when you modify it, make sure you record when you modified it, what you modified, why you modified it, and then so that when you look back over historical trends, you know that there is a difference in, you know, how you were scoring calls this month versus possibly a year ago. But I definitely think it should be, and I agree 100%, it should be an evolving process. You should be able to make changes and not, you know, not just have one and stick with it for eternity. So, and I wanted to throw a question at you, Mark. I think we were going to talk about this during the next slide, but I think it's fitting here to talk about some of the ways that speech analytics is able to automate the scoring process. I mean, I know we talked about there being a need for both components, but there is a scoring element that is available in speech analytics. Can you talk a little bit about how that's used?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think that it adds nicely to what you just mentioned. Obviously, compliance is a huge aspect of this, and you're going to have that compliance score. You know, you mentioned an agent having a passing score on a call, and one of the unique aspects of speech analytics is it allows you to, you know, look beyond the elements of your current scorecards, and by that I mean you can have a completely passive, 100% passing call. Stated the mini Miranda, gave the call recording disclosure, did a right party verification, you know, took a payment, totally polite, checked the box, everything's great. what speech analytics allows you to do is to drill down and start to look at collector effectiveness scores, start to look at silence scores, and give you more insight into what's actually happening. You know, from an effectiveness perspective, again, did they ask for a balance in full? Did they immediately go to a settlement? Did they ask for a payment directly? Are they demonstrating the ability to talk and type? You know, silence is a tremendous component of speech analytics, and it's some of the biggest low-hanging fruit from an efficiencies perspective of how it can help. You may have two agents who collect the same amount of fee, but one's average talk-off is 5 minutes and the other is 3. And it could simply be the ability for them just to talk and type, and that's something that you can train and coach with someone. So you have the ability to create as many scorecards as you want, really, based on the behaviors that you're looking to single out and identify as either the behaviors that are in your successful agents that you want to model, as well as the behaviors of the underperforming agents. You know, what can you pull out of these calls either way to coach and train the team to be more effective moving forward?
We actually have an excellent question, and it's for you, Cheryl. It kind of goes back to our last slide, but I think it's a really, really good question. So again, for Cheryl, in your experience in tying compliance/QA scores to the agent's compensation, do you see more improvement on agent scores by deducting the agent for a violation versus incentivizing them for perfect scores, or a combination of both? So have you seen an improvement in agent scores over time based on your model for tying that QA score to compensation?
Yes. I mean, I can't tell you what, you know, since we've been doing this, and since I've been here, you know, we've created a culture on the collection floor where it's kind of like a classroom setting where everyone's striving to get that 100. There's little tiny rewards in between for people that get 100. There's also rewards for people who don't get 100 but perhaps would still get that, quote, A grade, and even for those who get like a B. But, you know, it does work. I think you have to have some sort of, you know, positive reinforcement, but believe me, there's also a negative reinforcement. And you know, I know, Jesse, you're familiar with the people here at Monarch that refer to me as Darth Vader, and there's a reason for that. But
lovingly, though, Cheryl, lovingly referring to you as Darth Vader. Yeah, definitely has been critical in that culture of compliance. But go ahead, Mark. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to add, you know, one of the trends that we're seeing with some of our customers is they're starting to change and think about implementing changes to their compensation models. And I know we've got 1 or 2 customers, I believe, have started to take actual dollars collected out of the compensation model in an effort to eliminate the rogue collectors out there, the collectors that would do or say things that they shouldn't say in an effort to try and collect that money. And what they're instead doing is compensating or looking to compensate the agents based specifically on the statements that they need to say and the things they need to do on that call. And from their perspective, and from these customers that are looking to implement these changes, you know, their belief is that you know, you have a script that's been developed over time. If you deliver these things on the script, you are more likely to not be successful. So if we can remove all those potential compliance risks that you may think about doing to collect the fee, it may help them. So it's kind of interesting to us to hear people that are thinking about changing their compensation models based on their use of speech analytics.
I would just add to that you know, we do have compensation tied to compliance, but it's a combination of things. And I think that, you know, just basing it only on compliance wouldn't work that well for many clients over a period of time if you're 100% compliant but not bringing in the money. So, you know, you have to find that magical balance, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would add about speech analytics, and I think to Cheryl's point before about there needs to kind of be a combination of manual and speech analytics in her mind. I think it's going to vary depending upon what each individual customer may want. It's going to vary depending upon the infrastructure. At all of your different organizations, you have different call recording solutions. Some of you have the ability to have speaker-separated audio, which allows you to look at things specifically stated by the agent versus things specifically stated by the debtor. That can obviously affect things as well. So there's a lot of different variables that come into play with it.
Absolutely. Well, let's go ahead and move on since we are kind of running close on time. We have a ton of great questions right now. I want to let you know that we're going to try to get to most of those at the end. If not, we will definitely get you some answers after the presentation. But I wanted to put together a top 10 list of scorecard components, pretty much looking at this from a risk perspective and what should you have. And there's so much more than this top 10 list. I just want to say that because it was difficult for me to make the decision on what to put on this top 10 list. I probably should have called it a top 20 list and put more items on here. But anyway, I wanted to at least put something on here to give you some guidance here based on some of the activity that we've seen. But so the top 10 list is, of course, call recording disclosure being very, very important to the opening of the call, and the proper identification of the consumer to, obviously to make sure that you're preventing third-party disclosure, the mini Miranda. I think UDAP concerns are so critical right now, listening to the language for possible deception. Again, I definitely recommend reading the winter 2015 highlights because there were more areas of possible deception that were linked with, Regulation E and disclosures. So I definitely recommend reading that. Proper account updates, which here's where the auditor in me comes out saying you've got to look at this because how do you know that you're statusing accounts correctly, and especially for any of the debt buyers that are listening or anyone that's concerned about making sure that you're coding. Well, I know you all are, but I'm especially sensitive to debt buyers because I've been doing a lot of work with DBA recently. But proper account updating is so important to make sure that you have status is correct, the cease requests are being followed, and disputes are being followed up on. And are the payments being effectively applied to the account? I think this is where the manual agent, the manual call monitoring and compliance really comes into play and separates itself from doing everything 100% with speech analytics, because having that person who is listening to the call also being able to validate that the agent status the accounts correctly and that the payment was processed as the consumer instructed, I think are really valuable steps to include in your monitoring efforts, because if you're just listening to calls and you're not looking at the account information, I feel that you might be missing a really valuable piece. Again, other things of importance are the voicemail instructions were followed and proper communication regarding the consumer credit report, making sure that collectors are not, making false statements about the consumer's credit report are definitely things that I would recommend having on your scorecard. I know that, I think, Cheryl, you had a couple more items that we did not list in this top 10, but you had indicated you thought they were important. You want to talk a little bit about that?
One of them was the 1099-C disclosure for all the settlements, and every client is slightly different, but that's something that I think should always be on the scorecard, because there's lawsuits and things out there saying that if you don't get it, then it's a deceptive practice. The person's not making an informed decision on the settlement. And also one of the ones that we get all the time and that we score is permission to leave messages or call the numbers on the account, and whether it's a cell number or a home phone number or a business line, we just like the collector to verify that, and we get permission for each and every one of those, so that if there's ever a question, that's something, and we have a code that goes along with that. The same thing I also say with Regulation E, some agencies it applies, some agencies it doesn't, but if it does, you want to make sure that that's absolutely in the disclosure, in the scorecard.
Yeah, and I had a question here.
I'm sorry,
oh, go ahead.
The other ones that I think that that we always want is the exact amount of the debt, and we score the collector as to whether they give the proper amount of the debt and who the original creditor was, so that the consumer can't really be confused in any way.
Okay. I had a question about, I was mentioning the winter 2015 highlights. That's the CFPB supervisory highlights it's the winter 2015 edition that was released yesterday. You can find that through the CFPB's website or doing quick Google search for CFPB winter 2015 highlights. And what they were talking about there in regards to debt collection was some findings of, when they would notify the consumer verbally that within 24 hours they could make changes to the amount of a payment they had previously scheduled, where the discrepancies that they were finding was their policies and procedures, and what was actually happening was a 72-hour window. So again, there was another discrepancy between what policies and procedures say and what was actually being communicated to the consumer over the phone was being viewed as deceptive. So that was the thing that I was mentioning regarding that. So I think we can move on. We have about, 7 minutes or so left. So I wanted to get into call monitoring and analytics, because what good is doing all of this scoring if you're not going to do anything with the data? So this is one of those continuous improvement cycle functions of your compliance management system, is being able to effectively gather that analytics and do something with it. And we're going to definitely talk a lot more about what do you do with it to after you gather it. But I think it's important to record the monitoring results so that you have the data. Now, if you're just getting started with this, I want you to think about, how would you like to look at it, because that's going to change the way you gather it. So if you want to look at it at the client level, at the agent level, if you want to look at it first quarter versus second quarter, or monthly numbers, think about that as you're asking your agents to record the data so that you know what you want to get out of it. And there's a lot of different tools that you can use for this, and I'm not really sure. I would love to hear some feedback through the Q&A feature if anybody knows of any tools that are kind of out there to do this. But I know that, even using Excel, there was a call monitoring analytics dashboard that I made available through one of our other webinars, and it's a tool that I have put together, and it's quite simple. It uses Excel with some conditional formatting and can look at some data on a quarterly basis. I'd be more than happy to send that out to anybody who emails me after the presentation. But I wanted to ask Cheryl specifically, I know what are some of the tools that you guys are using for analyzing the call monitoring data?
Well, for us, we use Access and Excel, and Access gives us all the really nice reports and everything like that that the CFPB and everybody likes to use, and Excel is more of a daily tool, and once the scores are verified and logged into there, we keep a deficiency log in compliance department where, it's logged by the collector, by the client, by the deficiency, and multiple other things, so that we then take that and we don't even wait until the end of the week. If I have, if I identify a trend where there's multiple people that are having an issue on a certain thing, we address that on the fly. And if it's just one collector, for example, that has multiple deficiencies, I also address that immediately, not me personally, but either through the client developers, through training, or the managers. Sometimes it is bringing the person into my office, and that's what we do. You have to make sure that you are using the data that you're gathering to get a better outcome, and ultimately, you want to use that data so that you can create a culture of compliance in your agency.
Great. I know I was getting some feedback during the QA box, and I just want you to know, Mark, that someone is a fan of the Call Miner product and thinks you have an excellent dashboard. So you want to talk about that for a minute?
Well, I appreciate that, and we're always trying to make it better. But yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, what we want to try to do, or what speech analytics can help you do, is to start to look at the trends, start to understand training areas and real coaching opportunities. And I guess the primary difference is with a manual process, it's very time-consuming. Again, you're listening to 1 or 2% of the calls, typically on a 30-day basis. The power of speech analytics is it allows you to listen to whatever percentage of calls you want to, really, but do it today. So, you can understand the behaviors that your agents are demonstrating today to help them on their calls, maybe even this afternoon. And really the benefit of this technology, and we're constantly enhancing it, is we can provide access all the way down to your agents. So your agents can ultimately see their own performance and understand their own opportunity to self-cure and change their behaviors of what they're doing on those calls. But one thing I want to say, and I don't want to mislead anybody, this is not a set it and forget it type of technology. It's not something that you buy speech analytics and you plug it in and away it goes and you don't have to do anything. There was a question earlier, do you need to dedicate someone for speech analytics to be successful? And I would answer that yes. There is a constant calibration of this to enhance it and make it better for you and make it more accurate for you. Cheryl brought up a point earlier about there being false positives, and she's correct. There's always going to be false positives, no matter what speech analytics solution that you introduce, and that's going to vary based on a number of things. The quality of the audio, whether or not a speaker separated or not, is the agent speaking clearly, or are they mumbling, are they on a cell phone? So there's a number of different things that can affect the quality of the audio, but by having the ability to calibrate it and tune it, you can make it more accurate specifically for your organization. And I think from the perspective of it's never going to be 100%, I would agree with that, but if it's 85% correct and it's 85% correct for everybody, that's that uniformity that you were talking about, Jesse, earlier, where you want to have analytics or scorecarding done on the specified percentage of calls. I would say if you run analytics across 100% of the calls, the accuracy is what it is. It's going to be the same for every agent, and you can choose to accept that. You can choose to not accept that, and if you don't accept that, then you can tune it to continue to improve the accuracy. And I hope that makes sense.
Right. No, those are great points, Mark, and I appreciate you clarifying that, because we did have a couple of questions, too, that you kind of answered with what you just said, too. So I really appreciate that. Well, we only have 1 minute left, so let's go to the next slide. Actually, do we want to go to the next one? Or, well, we're going to talk about really quickly communicating the results. So communicating the results of analytics, obviously to the compliance committee, very, very important, since this is the Chief Compliance Officer series of our webinar series, it's important for you to understand the reporting of these call monitoring is very fitting to send that to the Board of Directors, the Executive Management, the Compliance Committee, however you're structured from a business perspective, making sure that those people at the top know where you are from a compliance monitoring effort. So let's go on to the next slide really quick, because I wanted to hit on these next level topics, and I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to kind of close this out today with Cheryl kind of giving us her overview of making the best use of the data, because this is really what's important to use the data in setting that tone for the culture of compliance. So Cheryl, you want to just say something really briefly about that? I'm sorry we're running out of time, everybody.
Yeah, just basically, if you use the data for coaching, you use the data for evaluations, you use the data for everything. When you're using compliance as your number one, goal in the company, but you just want to make sure that you don't just ignore the data, and you log it, you use it. We apply it across the board. You can use it for bonuses. You can use it for multiple other things. But that's all within your agency and how you want to do it. But you really, want to take that and use it for trends. We log so many different things here, and try to use all of this, the data and the speech analytics, in order to just create, the culture where compliance is number one, collecting the money is right there beside it. But we have to do it in the most compliant way possible.
Great. And we have people dropping off. Sarah, are we going to get cut off right at noon, or are we, okay, there was one more comment that I wanted Mark. Okay, I wanted Mark to just talk briefly. I'm sorry for going over, but there was one thing on the last slide, too, about some next level topics, and I wanted to What about third-party monitoring, Mark? I mean, as far as if you are a creditor or a debt buyer, what are some of the things that people are using speech analytics for now as far as monitoring third parties? Do you want to talk just briefly about that?
Yeah, so that is one of the models that some of our clients are starting to look at, where they have a downstream network either of agencies that are calling on their behalf or they place accounts with, and they're requiring those agencies on a monthly basis to send them calls that they in turn audit. You can leverage speech analytics much in the same fashion, and as long as you unify the format from all of your agencies that you're working with, where they're sending it to you in the same format, you can ingest it into a speech analytics solution and start to leverage that to see for yourself and make sure that they're doing the things that you're asking them to do.
Right, so maybe a component of vendor compliance management, which is something we've been talking a lot about, so I appreciate that. And I think that pretty much wraps it up. I'm so sorry, everybody, that we went over. We have a lot of great questions, and like I mentioned before, we're going to try to get some responses out to those questions after the webinar. My contact information is up there on the screen right now. Please email me if there's anything that I can do for you, or if you would like a copy of, like I mentioned, that the little analytics spreadsheet that I put together that might be helpful to some of you. But thank you so much to Mark and Cheryl. I appreciate the time today and for everything that you guys have done to prepare for this. Thank you so much for attending, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again, Mark, Cheryl, and Jesse. This has been a really informative hour. I did want to let everyone know that I'll be sending out recordings of the presentation as well for your reference.
And the slides as well, right, Sarah? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Okay.
Hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.